Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin, and on this channel I upload all sorts of videos relating to true crime, education and psychology topics. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy and you haven't already subscribed, then please do so. I also do have a second channel where I upload all of the beauty, fashion and lifestyle content that I don't really get to upload on here anymore. And also, if you're wanting to look for more sort of regular content from me, then I'm always active on my Instagram and my TikTok. They will be on the screen, but I'll also leave them in the description so you know where to look. So for today's case, I'm back with another solved case, but it definitely is one that is discussed quite heavily because of a lot of the details that occurred in the case. So I'm going to talk you guys through the initial case itself and also the investigation that followed and the trial and everything afterwards. It's a baffling one. I'd never heard of this before, so I'd definitely love to know your guys' thoughts on the case in the comments below. Before we get started, I'm just going to zoom through my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert on this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I may always find myself through research on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out or mispronounce things, and I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause any harm or any injustice. I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, we should just go ahead and get started discussing the case of the KRNAK family. So the case of the KRNAK family takes place in the summer months of the year of 1998. 55-year-old Alan KRNAK and his wife Donna, who was 52, lived in their home in a place called Helenville in Wisconsin with their two sons, Andrew, who was 29, and Thomas, who was 21. Donna, Alan and their youngest son, Thomas, were last seen on July the 2nd of 1998 in their family home, with the last person having seen the trio being the eldest son, Andrew. According to Andrew, the family had left their Helenville home to head out on a fishing trip to their summer cabin in a place called Coloma in Wisconsin, along with the family dog, a Cocker Spaniel. The KRNAK family were extremely active. They were particularly talented hunters, hikers, campers, fishers. They spent a lot of their time in the outdoors, taking part in one activity or another, and their trip to their cabin that weekend had been a relatively typical activity for them. 7 days after this point, a missing persons report had been filed by Thomas, stating that he had been concerned for his family's welfare as they hadn't returned home after the weekend as they planned. The following day, on July the 10th, 1998, it was reported that someone had discovered a black Chevrolet pickup truck in a forest area in a place called Sauk County, Wisconsin. I apologise if I mispronounced that. Upon the collection of the number plate details, it was then confirmed by the authorities that the vehicle had belonged to the missing KRNAK parents, and this finding had immediately been a concerning one from the perspective of the authorities, and so as a result the truck was searched thoroughly for any indication of the potential whereabouts of the missing trio, acting initially on the assumption that the three of them had been in the car and left it in the place that it was found. They discovered that the inside as well as the exterior of the truck had been cleaned entirely, meaning there were no fingerprints to be collected whatsoever, no sign of any DNA evidence, whether it be from the KRNAKs or not. There was no sign of any belongings or luggage that would have likely been in the family's possession when they were heading on their trip away, and when Andrew was spoken to regarding this matter, he confirmed that the family had in fact packed belongings prior to leaving for their trip. So if the KRNAKs had been in the car at the point where it was found in this forest area, there would have likely been some sign of possessions, luggage, anything. There were no impressions on the ground surrounding the truck, so no footprints, no tyre tracks that would have given the investigators some sort of idea of how the truck ended up in that area and where those inside the truck could have potentially gone. Interestingly, the authorities had noticed something when they checked the mile log for the family's truck. There was around 2,618 miles that they could not provide an explanation for. The mile log was something that was maintained by the KRNAK family. It was very detailed. They listed every single trip they'd been on, every stop they'd make, every petrol fill up had been written down, and so these unaccounted for miles had seemed particularly unusual and possibly concerning to the authorities because this mile log that they kept was so detailed. It didn't seem like they would make a habit of leaving these miles unaccounted for. When the authorities had spoken to Andrew regarding a potential explanation as to what these miles could have meant, Andrew had not been able to provide authorities with any sort of explanation, any indication of what they could have been for, but he did admit at this point that he had in the past driven the truck on numerous occasions. He had told the investigators that his younger brother Thomas had been the one that typically drove the truck, and he was the one in charge of keeping the mile log up to date, and he offered the explanation that his younger brother was likely to blame for these unaccounted for miles. And at one point, investigators had asked him for his own opinion on what he thought could have happened to his parents and his brother. And this is where he mentioned his brother again, but in a rather surprising scenario. According to Andrew at this point, his brother had a particularly troublesome relationship with both of his parents, but most specifically his father. Andrew went on to say that Thomas had also just bought himself a new hunting rifle, and this knowledge raised a potential scenario that the youngest son had possibly had something to do with the KRNAK parents' disappearance. When the authorities had looked into the rifle, the purchase, it was known that Thomas had previously returned back to the store where he'd bought the rifle in the first place to modify the weapon for improved accuracy. But when the authorities had inquired at the store regarding this modification that Thomas had made, they discovered that Thomas had not yet returned to the store to pick up his rifle, and it was still in the store's possession. One interesting fact in this case is that a few days after the members of the KRNAK family were reported as officially missing, the eldest son Andrew had changed his name legally to Derek Nicholas Anderson. So in all sources and accounts of this case, that's how he's referred to as Derek Anderson, and there's not really a lot of explanation as to why he did this. He'd also allegedly had multiple previous convictions in recent years relating to charges of theft and breaking and entering, and then the following month after his family's disappearance, Derek, or Andrew, was arrested and jailed on drink driving, driving with a revoked licence and probation violation charges. There remained no sign of the three family members or their dog for some time, and it remained a huge local mystery, with many people beginning to sort of speculate different parts of the case, including whether or not the family had made it to their cabin at all. And then in December of 1999, a set of human remains were discovered in the area of Roy Taylor Forest in North Carolina. It was determined that these remains belonged to an adult male, and the discovery of these remains were only connected with the KRNAK family disappearance in 2001, when they were positively identified as being that of missing Alan KRNAK through an examination and comparison of dental records. The autopsy initially carried out on the remains following their discovery had determined that the victim had died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head, and when authorities had carried out a search of the nearby area following the discovery, they came across a number of things of interest, namely things that could later be possibly connected to the KRNAK family disappearance. They discovered a pair of men's briefs, a woman's t-shirt, a wedding ring, and the remains of a small dog. The dog's remains were believed to have been that of the KRNAK family's Cocker Spaniel, but these couldn't ever really be proven. However, authorities were able to determine that the wedding ring they discovered in the same area of the remains had belonged to Donna KRNAK. On a closer inspection of the ring, they discovered the initials AFK had been engraved on the inner band, and when local authorities searched the initials into a missing persons database, it flagged up the disappearance file of Alan KRNAK. Despite these findings, there remained no sign of Donna or Thomas or any indication of what had happened to the family. If you think back to the unaccounted for miles in the mile log that the authorities had initially found when they discovered the vehicle, it was believed that these unaccounted for miles would have been enough for someone to drive to the location of where Alan's remains were found and then back, since it had been around a 1,500 mile trip, but it would have meant that the perpetrator would have started in the area of where the family were from. In the summer months of 1999, the eldest KRNAK son, who was now named Derek Anderson, had pled guilty to a federal loan fraud charge following the discovery that he had lied on a student loan application. And as a result of this charge, he had spent time in a federal prison, but this did then raise questions regarding Derek's activity as a student at the Western Carolina University. So while a student between the years of 1991 and 1996, he had been living in a place called Cullowhee, I apologise if I mispronounced that, in North Carolina, and as it would turn out, he would spend a lot of time hiking in the Roy Taylor Forest, the same location in which the remains of his father were discovered. Initially, the location of the remains had been a strange finding for investigators, as there had been no indication of why they would be in that area, especially with the car being found somewhere entirely different. But then the knowledge of Derek's familiarity with this forest began to raise questions. And there aren't a lot of details regarding the investigation at this point because of when it occurred, but it is known that Derek was released from prison on this loan fraud charge on February the 1st in 2001 and moved then to a halfway house. And not long following his release, Derek was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide relating to his father's death. Due to the location where Alan KRNAK's remains were discovered, Derek had been initially charged in North Carolina, but these charges were ultimately dropped simply because authorities had no way of proving that Alan had been killed in North Carolina, and instead Derek was then charged in Wisconsin. As it would turn out, a phone call had actually been placed by Derek to his father at work the day of his disappearance, and the phone call led to Alan leaving work rather abruptly. He left early, and his colleagues had stated that his reasoning behind leaving work early had been a family emergency and, quote, that he may have to go to a funeral. They noted that his behaviour had changed entirely once he'd ended this phone call, and he appeared openly distressed. And when the authorities had discovered the evidence of this phone call in the early days of the investigation, Derek had denied having placed the phone call to his father consistently, so no answers could be drawn from this. However, he later admitted to authorities that he had in fact placed the phone call to his father at work, but it was because he was in the middle of fixing his parents' car and he was looking for a certain tool that he couldn't find, so he rang his father to ask him for help. The only explanation he had offered the authorities regarding the reports of his father's change in behaviour following this phone call had been that he had lied to be able to get out of work early so that they could go ahead on their planned trip. Alan's co-workers didn't have a lot of knowledge regarding his home life, but a number of them did report that they were aware of a troubled relationship between Alan and his eldest son, which, if you recall back to the start of the video, contradicts what Derek or Andrew had said about the troubled relationship being between Alan and Thomas, the youngest son. A lot of this turmoil between Derek and his father had been seemingly due to the fact that Derek had been living with his parents following his graduation from university, and he remained unemployed for quite some time despite the fact that he had a lot of student loan debt. Following graduating with a bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology, Derek had then enrolled himself in some graduate classes at the University of Wisconsin Whitewater campus, which had obviously then added to his student loan debts. According to one of Alan's co-workers, there had allegedly been an incident at some point in the past where Derek had had an argument with his father and then proceeded to attack him with a club. And obviously all of these reports on these alleged troubled relationships between Alan and his eldest son, it really just sort of compounded on this doubt relating to Derek's innocence. The trial of Derek Anderson took place in 2006, and he initially pleaded not guilty to the murder of his father. The trial saw the defence team insisting there was no evidence whatsoever that connected the murder to Derek, only that it was just a theory that the authorities had been following, nor had there been any evidence linking him to his mother and brother's disappearance. And in response to these claims, the prosecution had proposed a theory in which he had murdered his family in order to gain access to their money from a number of sources, mainly just their estate wealth, which would have made him roughly $550,000 to $600,000 richer. It was also revealed that Derek had been treated for poison oak reactions just 2 weeks after his family were last seen, something that many people, including a lot of the authorities, had believed had been an indication of his visit to the North Carolina forest. The jury on the trial deliberated for a total of almost 24 hours over the 3-day period, and then in 2006, Derek Anderson was found guilty and convicted of the murder of Alan KRNAK. There had been no charge in relation to the disappearance of Thomas and Donna KRNAK, since no evidence of remains were ever found following the search of Roy Taylor Forest. Many people appear to believe that they were in fact victims of Derek Anderson and that he had buried their remains somewhere in North Carolina, since he was particularly familiar with certain areas, but there remains no evidence connecting him. And in 2009, Derek Anderson had attempted to appeal his life sentence, but he was ultimately rejected. And so that is where I'm going to end today's video. Obviously I said at the start that it was a solved case, but there remains a lot of discussion around certain areas, and I'm sure you can gather now why, because it is solved in the sense that Alan KRNAK's murder was solved and someone has been convicted, but there remains a lot of uncertainty regarding what happened to Thomas and Donna KRNAK. So I'd love to know your guys' thoughts down below. If you have any theories, if you think it really is open and shut that they were victims of Andrew or Derek Anderson, but authorities had never found any evidence of so. I'd love to know your thoughts. But yeah, that is where I'm going to end today's video. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.